friends. This is Tillery Timmons-Sims, and I'm welcoming you back to another episode of Conservation Stories. Conservation Stories is a podcast brought to you by the Sand Hill Area Research Association, or SARA, as we like to say, because it's less of a mouthful. And I have with me today Darren Hudson from Texas Tech. Mm-hmm. Darren, I'm excited to have you here because we actually have had a conversation before with an economist, you know, the guy that sits behind the spreadsheet and stuff, you know. And so I'm really like to follow up in just some more impactful, maybe applied, you know, how is this the situation we're in really going to impact not just a farmer who's listening, but somebody who is a consumer in Lubbock, for them to understand the impact. And so we've already been having good conversations. So I want us to like rewind. And would you just give a little introduction to yourself to the listeners so they'll know like who you are, where you're from?
Yeah. Well, my name's Darren Hudson. I am an agricultural economist. I guess I've got about 10 titles. One of them is Combest Endowed Chair for Agricultural Competitiveness, so in the Department of Ag and Applied Economics. I'm also the Associate Dean for Strategic Initiatives at Davis College, so I'll leave all the others off. But I grew up in White Deer, Texas, up in the Panhandle, long before they grew cotton up there. Now they have cotton, but it's a mix. Grew up in the Panhandle. My wife's from the Panhandle. She's from Pampa, and or the Pampa area. She went to school in Pampa and went to West Texas. It was West Texas State then.
Yes.
They offered. I was last year. They offered me to pay $75, and they changed it to West Texas A&M. And I said if I had wanted to go to Texas A&M, I would have gone to Texas A&M.
Oh, that's funny.
And then went to grad school here at Tech, and then spent about 12 years at Mississippi State University, and then came back here. So
awesome.
Been here since 2008. Yeah.
Wow. Well, White Deer is the home of the scarab. The scarab, right?
Scarab, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I've been there and seen that's it's a manure mixer and flinger.
Yes, manure mixer. That's a good description for it. Politically correct description for it.
Yes.
I actually Marvin Urbanzik created that, and I went to school with his kids.
I know Mark is who I know, and
Mark,
I met his dad. Took me for riding his Tesla.
Oh yeah,
it was a lot of fun.
I just rode in my fully self-driving Tesla the other day.
Oh wow.
It was an interesting experience. I'm not sure I trust it yet, but
wow.
But it was cool.
This was not that kind.
Yeah.
No. But I was the first time I'd ridden in one. It was wow.
Yes.
Yeah. But they're really great people. So man, that's a great place. And you're right. It's now a place where we're growing cotton.
It is.
Haven't before.
Yeah.
Still have water there.
Yes. Yeah. In fact,
for a while anyway.
Yeah. The Carson County Gin sits right at the corner.
Right there at their house.
Right there by their house. So,
it does.
Yeah.
And isn't the biggest gin in Texas up in the Panhandle? Not there.
Yeah,
but
Adobe Walls. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. That's the biggest.
Yeah.
Not quite sure why they built it that big, but it
Yeah.
does service a large area, and
Yes.
transportation with the bales and everything has changed so much.
It has.
That's definitely impacted the gin structure around Texas, everywhere.
Everywhere, right. Yeah, because for people that don't know, we used to have to haul modules or trailers first, and then a module which was a compressed, rectangular, large, like the size of a semi-trailer.
Yeah, about the semi-trailer.
Yeah. And so that's a lot of money to haul that. Now they're just more simple hay bale, large round hay bale style.
Yeah.
And
you can, the nice thing is you couldn't put those modules on an interstate highway. So the module trucks had to travel, back roads. Now they just load those just like they do hay bales on a semi, and you can, go 80 miles an hour down the highway. So it certainly changes the transportation costs a lot.
Right. But it shifted our economy too, because we had a gin every, 20 miles or something for when I was growing up. They were just
everywhere
because you just couldn't haul. Even before modules, I remember being in a trailer and stomping cotton down and fish, and you just couldn't go very far pulling those old rick.
No.
And of course, everyone we had was like falling apart.
Yes. Yeah. They were probably built in the 1930s.
Yes.
You were still using them. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Exactly. That changed a lot of things. So we were talking we talked about a lot of things so far, and trying to rewind and figure out where to start over, because we've discussed a lot of things that I think are really valuable. And let's start with how farming has changed since the 90s. Maybe the innovation era, I guess.
Yeah.
Might call that more like the genetic innovation era.
Yeah.
And the impact. I was talking to a local farmer who was saying that at the time he was saying this is going to bring consequences we're not going to want.
Right.
And in some ways we're setting in that time period that he predicted.
Yep.
So, and we're not talking about that we have issues with the science of GMOs, or we're not arguing whether they're healthy or not, or any of those things. We're just talking about unintended consequences. Right. And I'll be interviewing later today a farmer from Arkansas who is very eloquent on this type of situation. So this is I think a great introduction to that. So
yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, I think that's a good name. The biotech revolution. I mean, it's been around for a while, but it certainly kicked in the late 80s and early 90s. And by 1996, 97, you had the introduction of Roundup Ready soybeans as the first iteration of that. And it did two things. One, and I was at Mississippi State when this happened. And one of the interesting things is talking to farmers then. They just loved it. It's like, oh, this is great. And I'm like, why? What's the rationale? And he goes, well, look, with Roundup Ready, I could basically turn my farmhand loose. I can go deep sea fishing, right? And that was a prelude to this idea that management changed significantly as a result of that technology. You no longer had to plan your cultivations, plan your herbicide applications, all that sort of stuff. You just threw it out there. And so the management intensity reduced quite a bit, which farmers liked initially.
Yeah, well, and that's a nice, convenient thing. Anybody,
absolutely.
I mean, people put in, all kinds of structures and other businesses to make things more efficient. Yeah.
And so then what happened was, as they rolled forward in time and we had more transgenic crops, and most everything initially was just herbicide tolerance. That was the big thing. Right. And so what happened is that a lot of those farmers, because management became so easy, they started getting rid of their plows. They started getting rid of, and then they began to forget the strategies that were required. And we clipped along there for quite a while that, this was great. Everything was going great. It was smooth. And then you had herbicide-resistant pigweed. That kicked off at Palmer Amaranth kicked off in the Mid-South.
Right.
And what happened then is that herbicide tolerance meant that they had to start to shift. Well, initially, they just came out with new chemistry. And that chemistry worked for a while. And then it became less effective. And
it becomes less effective because the plant literally evolves.
Exactly. Yeah.
It selects.
It selects for the one, there's a mutation in every population, in humans or whatever, that's going to be resistant to something. And so they're the ones that survive, and then they reproduce, and then,
Right.
And so, on pesticide tolerance, we did a better job of creating buffer zones and things like that that allowed non-resistant populations to reproduce, and so it kept the efficacy of those chemistries better, but we didn't on the plant side, and we didn't do as good a job. And so what ended up happening was, sorry about that. So what ended up happening was the management had to shift back, and you started to have to use new chemicals, pre-plant, pre-emergence. And then you just had to start putting steel in the ground, and so
meaning you had to plow.
You had to plow, and so now we've gotten to this this strange confluence of not, really not wanting to plow because of, water conservation, soil health, that sort of thing. But you have these resistant weeds. And so, now what's happening is the over-reliance on that technology has put us in a position where we're almost going back to the 1950s to have to address some of these problems. And it's making management a lot harder. And so, I think those unintended consequences are, the things that, because nothing is 100% effective. And so it creates these events like Palmer Amaranth and other things that then complicate it beyond where it was even before. So that's where we're at, and it's a challenge for farmers, right? They're coming into this. They're coming into an environment now where all inputs are much more expensive. Crop prices are a lot lower. How do I handle all these things? And so now we've got to start looking at things like rotations and things that producers are less comfortable with, especially younger producers who never lived in an environment where they did that before.
Yes, yeah. Well, and you grow up. I mean, my husband he's in his 60s. It's like 64, and so he, is more relates to his grandparents' style of farming, and I mean that's what he is almost like that. Not just one generation, but two back, and he was very connected to that. And you know what I mean? But like, if our kids were farming today, they would have no connection. And it sets a different expectation in those kids for what the job is going to be, and what that's going to look like for them, and I think I've seen some people really adapt well to that, you know what I mean? And then really can begin to enjoy it if it made money.
Yes, if it made money. Yeah.
Because now you're back to where I'm working like my great grandparents did, but I'm certainly not making money like my great grandparents did, because I know that my mom's dad, I mean, he did well. There was a good chunk of time in there, you know what I mean, where he did well. They were able to buy a little house on the lake and, that kind of stuff. And, that's just not always the situation anymore.
Well, I do, I think too, you point to that, is there is a very different level of expectations on standard of living.
Absolutely, yes.
Today than there was in the 50s,
so true.
40s and 50s. And so, if you drive around the South Plains, and you see some of these old farmhouses that are still out there. They're small. There's no amenities around them, things like that.
I know.
And so, I think a lot of kids think they're supposed to get out and have that big house.
Well, let me just say, as someone who grew up living in the country, and then when I married, we lived in two different places that were, I always would say, conveniently located in any direction, 75 miles to a Walmart. You know? Exactly. And when we made the decision which was very difficult, because it's weirdly part of your identity, to move into town and you've never had neighbors, and what if they have a dog, or you have a dog that barks and they don't like barking dogs, or, I mean, there's like so many different things that you don't think about. But after about 2 weeks, I was coming home from Walmart or somewhere, like 5 minutes from my house. I called my husband. I was like, "There's a reason people move to town, because it is very convenient."
Very convenient. Yes. Well, and you and I talked about this earlier. I mean, I think through that 90s, 2000s era, when the management intensity sort of dropped off in farming, is you had so many people relocate, like here in Lubbock,
a lot of people. We were living in Brownfield during that time. We were living out in the country. But I know a lot of people, it was very convenient for them to be able to move. It was, and they were able to have choices, more choices for their kids, and so I don't think anybody was wrong to make that decision. I think everybody gets to do what they want that's best for their family, but it does leave unintended consequences.
Right. Well, and I have a neighbor of mine. I live in Tech Terrace, a good friend. He farms in Crest.
Yeah.
And so, he
Yeah.
commutes back.
Right.
They have a small old farmhouse that he'll
Yes.
stay in some during
Yeah.
the week when it's, heavy.
Yeah.
But it's all changed dramatically. And a lot of that was technological driven. I mean, I think that, we talk about the number of gens that are disappearing because of the round bales. All of this stuff is leading to, basically a very cultural shift, out on the prairie. It's just,
Right. Right.
I mean, you drive around out here now, and you know where everybody's house was because you see trees.
Yes.
But the houses are
The houses
gone.
are gone.
And,
exactly. Exactly. Well, I think just that the time, not just like of, hey, it's more convenient, it's better for my family for us to live here and have more choices. It's also, it creates that disconnectedness too, and so that's what I think is there was a time where you could make money
Yes.
on, a section of land. There's an interview I talk about frequently. My husband's grandparents from 1971. It's in the Southwest collection, and they're asking, "Well, are you going to get more land and get bigger?" And he was like, "Well, I just have to get more equipment, and then I'd have to get more help, and so no, I'm not going to do that." Well, and that's fine if you're willing to stay in that location in that smaller place, and you don't want to expand your living.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I do see that there's a certain subsection of people that want that life. They want pigs, they want chickens, they want goats. Why anybody wants goats, I don't know. But I mean, don't you know? Weed control. There you go. There you go. Rent someone's goats. Let them take care of them and keep them in a fence. But they crave that lifestyle that our grandparents didn't want us to have to live.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I think it's different now than it was when our grandparents were around. I think there are modern conveniences that make that kind of life more enjoyable, right?
Yeah.
But and I do think, and this relates back to a topic we talked about earlier, is we went through a phase, and in some respects we're kind of stuck in this phase, at least in some groups, that bigger is better, right? And because the idea is I have to maximize the amount of stuff I produce when they're not maximizing their profit, right? And the statement that your grandparents were making, I've heard farmers here make. Lloyd Arthur at Crosbyton is one of those. He says, if I get bigger, I have to do more of this stuff. And so, you go to the size, you've got $1 million cotton picker. Well, go to the size of farm that makes sense for that $1 million cotton picker. Don't go to the next size, which requires the second million.
One. Yes.
Because then you have to go, you basically have to double in size in order to make that economically rational. So I think, because assets are lumpy, that kind of stuff where you can't just continuously smooth it out over one more acre.
Interesting. I was in TAL, the Texas Ag Leadership Program, and we went to a beautiful Amish farm. And the Amish farmer's like, ask me anything, and that was my question is, you have 50 acres. How do you make a living on 50 acres? How do you do it? And, he was like, well, I mean, of course they grow everything they eat. And I mean, it's you can look at their life and go, because I have a horse and a buggy and not $1 million, you know what I mean? And so, I mean, and they're diversified, of course, in their economics. He said, but if I get 100 acres, I have to get more equipment. And I can't do it myself, and so of course, they're having, issues with their kids being able to find another 50 acres. And so they're expanding into other areas and things like that. But it's that same, I realized, because we were asking him, like, well, how do you have a phone that's in your barn and not in your house? And what I thought was so wise is he said, we think very hard before we bring something into our home.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't think about what will happen to our kids.
Mm-hmm.
We think, what could this be in 5 generations?
Right.
And that reminds me of Wendell Berry, who wrote the book
Mm-hmm.
Unsettling of America, where he was predicting exactly where we are right now.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, technology's good, technology's bad. Well,
It's what
I
we do
think,
with it.
I think the story is, you hear a lot of people, technology's neutral.
Exactly.
It's what you choose to do
Right.
with it. And so I think,
Yep.
but the lure, like Roundup Ready, the
Mm-hmm.
lure of I can now do other things,
Right.
outweighed the thinking about what are the implications of this for,
Right.
everything
Well, and
else.
even more for people to understand, even more than fishing,
Yeah.
it's like, oh, I can go out of town and go to my sister's wedding.
Yeah, you're
That's
not
in
tied to
May.
that, right?
Yes,
You're not
yes,
tied to
yes.
it where you have to babysit this crop
Right.
every day.
Yeah.
And so, it changes, but it's like anything, right? I mean, this, the analogy I use to students is I said, all of this stuff operates the same way in human psychology.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, if your partner, your spouse or whoever, if your partner chooses or is willing to do a particular task, then you take for granted that task is going to be done and you go do
Right.
something else.
Right.
Now, in a way, that's good, right? It's
Right.
a way of expanding, but it also means that what happens if that person can't do that task, or they decide they don't want to do that task
Yes.
anymore, right?
Right.
And so,
Yeah.
but it's you create unintended consequences when any decision you make creates
Yes,
unintended
exactly.
consequences.
Yes.
But some of those are really far-reaching. Some of them are so long in time horizon, people just don't. I joke with my wife, and she, I go to Whataburger and get a cheeseburger, and she goes, "Well, that's going to kill you." And I'm like, "Well, not today."
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And so in my time horizon that I'm thinking about, I'm like,
It's not even on my radar.
it's not even on my radar.
Right.
And so I think that's what we went through, have gone through.
Mm-hmm.
And then now you're seeing this return back as producers out there are looking. They know that water's running out, right? And they've got to try to figure out a way of how to continue to survive in a world that's going to have a lot less water for them, right? Irrigation in particular.
Well, and I was just mentioning, I met with a water organization foundation yesterday, and they were like, it really doesn't matter where you are.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone's got this. This is the problem.
Yeah.
This is ultimately the problem.
Right.
When you have a drought on the Mississippi River, you're like, what is going on?
Yeah. Well, and for years, with the Water Development Board, the planning, the prescriptions of whether or not we're going to restrict pumping and all this other stuff, and I kept saying the answer is actually pretty simple: is that economics will take care of that problem. It's like, if it's no longer feasible to pump water, it makes no economic sense to pump water to grow corn. You're not going to do it, right? And so, at the end of the day, the economics kind of takes care of that problem. Obviously, there are some places that are like out of water, right? It's gone. Yeah. They're having to haul water to their houses,
right?
But across the whole area, you're already seeing the reduction, right? Mm-hmm. But you and I were having this conversation. Part of the problem we had, I say problem, I mean, it was the thinking was, let's increase the water use efficiency, right? Let's get better at using this.
Right.
So we went from flood irrigation to center pivots and LIPA and, all those systems, and now drip. And with each increment, we were definitely getting a lot more efficient at using water, right? But that's not conservation, right? What happened is we just used more water, because the more efficient we were at using it, the more profitable it became per unit of water.
Right.
And so, producers are behaving rationally. It's like, if I can pump that underground, in a drip system, and my yield goes up by 40%,
right.
Well, I can afford to put more water in there. I can make sure that plant has all the water it possibly needs, rather than thinking about where at the margin is the best place to apply that water. And so, I tend to tell producers that you don't sell cotton, you don't sell sorghum, you don't sell corn, you sell water. And so what you should be doing is looking at how do I maximize my returns, my profits, per acre inch of water.
So, and that brings up something I mentioned too, is like water credits.
Yeah.
And we talk about carbon credits might work somewhere else, but here we're not going to hold a lot of carbon in sand.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think it's more likely that, carbon offset credits. So a data center comes in and they're using X amount of water. Well, pay a farmer somewhere else, not to be using that water.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so maybe you're using that water up north, but someone down here has turned off and now a third of their land is back in native grass.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I feel like if leave your system in place. So if we have a horrible drought, then, but I don't know how. I just see a brick wall that's 20 years away. Because I remember they were saying in the 90s we had 50 years of irrigation, and now I heard someone say, "Wait, we have 20." I was like, "Well, we're going to hit that mark.
Yeah,
we're on task."
Yes,
and so I see this brick wall for the land that that we own or we're going to inherit, and for people that I love, I see what is going to happen to the economy of Lubbock because people have no clear understanding of what the businesses that will go away.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the restaurants that you enjoy and the places you enjoy shopping that are being like almost half of their economics are coming from people that don't live in Lubbock.
Right.
And so that's this brick wall I see, and I think, how could we're going to hit this wall. How do we hit it going 20 miles an hour and not 100?
Yeah, that's a good analogy. And what worries me even more is, Lubbock has tech, Lubbock has the hospitals, Lubbock has other things that buffer it.
Right.
But, still about a third of the economic output is directly related to ag. But it's the brownfields, the level lands, the plain
absolutely.
views, all of those places that are really heavily dependent, and it's going to change, right? And, we've got to be creative. I think one of the things, and it's not like I'm advocating for any one particular thing,
right?
But I think we need to be open-minded to think about this, right?
Yes.
And when you talk about like water credits, right? One of the problems with water credits is we have right of capture,
right?
Water in the state of Texas, which I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm saying
it comes with its own
comes with its own set of rules and regulations and abilities.
Yeah.
And so if Farmer A decides they're going to participate, Farmer B just pumps it right out from underneath them. And so,
I know.
But there are strategies, we call them like agglomeration bonuses, right? So if you're that data center, you don't contract with one farmer. You contract with a co-op that manages this whole area. So every farmer agrees to reduce.
So is that happening anywhere in Texas? Because it's happening in Kansas.
Yes, in Kansas
that's the LEMA program.
Yeah, that's a model that we need to try to investigate. There are other places that are different. If you go down to the Edwards Aquifer, it's a flow system, not a stock system, and so you've got to be relevant or
it needs to be place based.
Place based.
Yeah.
But I think there are some ways to make that work, and it's also we've got to change the way we think about a lot of things. One of them, for example, soil, right, is, you can throw out terms, regenerative, whatever those are.
Yeah.
But the issue is that we are extracting, benefits out of the soil. And so what we need to start thinking about that is an optimal extraction problem right? So, you know,
Right.
what are the inputs in, what are the inputs out? How do you create more sustainable, you know,
Right.
long-term growth? The water is the same way
Yeah.
in the sense that, you know, for us, it's a stock resource. And so, you know, one of the interesting things we know is like if I told you today, High Plains Underground Water District is going to put down, you know, next year or 2 years from now,
Right.
is going to put down a hard pumping restriction like they do in Kansas, right? What I can tell you is that more water will be pumped out of that aquifer over the next 2 years than probably the last 15 years combined. Because what they'll do is try to maximize the extraction, right? And so you've got to really start thinking about this like an optimal extraction problem, like a fisheries problem. Like you can overfish a fishery. If you just turn everybody loose, and so what you have to do is to start thinking about how do you regulate that. And so
Yes,
co-ops and
Right.
you know the problem with, you know, top down administrative fiat, like here's your pumping allotment, right? Is that that is not going to affect all producers in the same way. Right. Some producers,
Yes.
it's going to dramatically reduce the revenues. Others, it's not because they don't have the pumping capacity to meet that. So we need to think about, you know, be creative. Think about a way like a regional co-op that says revenue is going to be shared in that instance.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
and
Right.
revenue is shared based on the reduction in the
Yeah.
water,
Right.
water pumping capacity, you know, things
Right.
like that.
Yeah.
Lots of details to think about, but I think we've got to get moving in a direction that addresses that. And one of the things that, you know, one of the missions of Davis College at Tech, which, you know, when I was writing the strategic plan, is water is our single most important thing. So everything we do needs to focus on addressing how do we operate with less water. So whether that's a livestock system or an integrated system, cropping and livestock system, or, you know, water technologies,
Right,
you know,
right.
drought tolerance to reduce the risk to producers on dry
Yes.
year. You know,
Right.
everything needs to be pushing in that direction because that is essentially the defining problem of our time.
Right.
You know, I love people talk about,
Yes.
you know, climate change and carbon and all, you know, that's all fine and good. But the defining problem for us of our time is water. And so we've got to be figuring out how do we do that.
Right. Well, and you know, the climate is always changing, and I think it's wise for us to not get stuck on semantics, but to say, you know, for whatever reason it's changing, the reality is here's what we're living in, and so we can assume that it will cycle back around, but we don't know that it will.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I know it was just I read an article this morning about this new cold front that came through. And that is something, a pattern that like is brand new, you know, and they're like, this is like different than anything we've ever seen before.
Right.
And a little harder to predict. And it might mean then that there'll be a little more dangerous storms because of the way it's basically warmer.
Yeah.
And so it's letting that cold
air
air
in.
kind of just steals through where it hadn't been sneaking through before.
Right.
You know, and so whatever's causing it, we can all agree that we should be preparing to live in the world that we're living in, you know?
Well, and we spent, I mean, you know, if you look at historical record for what we've got, right, is about every 30 years we have an extended drought period, right? So 50s, 80s, you know.
Right.
And so we're in that extended dry period. Now, you know, whatever's going to happen is going to happen.
Right.
But the thing about it is that we know 30 years from now, we're probably going to be in an extended dry period. So what we need to start thinking about now is how do we address or deal with that problem?
Right.
And then you have new ones come up. I mean, you know, we all know.
Yeah.
I mean,
or even then when we're not in that period, what do we do when we're not?
yes.
That will help us through the
that.
next one, you know? I don't know. I think the thing that I know that in the Lima case in Kansas, I mean, that's the thing I think the state has wanted us to do in Texas is you have your local districts, you guys decide and figure out how you're going to, for a better word, police yourselves.
Exactly.
You know? And so what I've heard like some frustration, you know, up
Yeah.
from like, legislators and people that are like, you're not doing anything,
Yeah.
but you're
Well,
not
if
doing
you-
anything.
and if you look, what's interesting, and this isn't to be overly critical, but the North Plains Underground Water District,
Yes.
Dalhart area,
Yes.
started implementing pumping restrictions a lot earlier, right? Excuse me. But the intent is to allow producers to figure out how to transition and move towards that. And of course, we had, a few years back, we had the big, blow up here in the High Plains. But part of that was because there was no groundwork prepping people for that transition.
Right.
It was just, we better do something. And then, when it gets announced, everybody throws a fit. And, it's not that there wasn't fit throwing in the North Plains Underground Water District. Right. But if you go to one of their meetings now, every producer's on board. Right, they are behind all of these things because they see what the benefits are for the long term. So, it takes a coordinated effort. It takes laying the groundwork. It takes prepping people. And we had done this little study when I was at Tech back when this was happening, and I was showing the benefits of an electric meter. Right.
Yes. Yeah.
And I was presenting this to people. We were presenting it to people and talking about, why wouldn't you want to know? This is your most expensive input.
Right.
Why don't you want to know how much you're putting on? Right? Because you could be putting on way too much. You could, you could be underutilizing it, whatever it is, but you don't know. And how do you manage it if you don't measure it? And of course, the response was, well, I don't want the government knowing anything, right?
Yeah.
But there are ways around that, right? And there are ways around that. But but it takes time to lay that groundwork and get people ready, to make that next leap.
I think it's true. It's interesting because I've had a couple conversations recently about ply lakes with people that I had made assumptions that they understood their value. And because I thought I beat this. I mean, people got to be sick of hearing me talk about ply lakes because it's a beating this horse to death, But I'm like, oh my goodness, we cannot stop talking about this. It is something we have to be talking about, and we can't assume that everyone's heard.
Yeah.
That everyone knows and understands.
Yeah, and ply lakes are a good example of. There's a whole group of people out there that either see them as a nuisance or don't understand them, right? There are some people out there that either are just, mildly tolerant of I've got to manage around this thing, or they're very, advocate for ply lakes.
Yeah.
But, educating people to tell them it's important for water recharge. It's important for filtration. It's important for wildlife habitat. It's important, all of these things so that, when you get to the point where you need to do something, if you need to do something, they're all, they're prepared. They go, okay, I understand why we have to do X. And
right.
So, you just got to keep beating that horse, and people get sick of it. But, at the same time, it's important because not everybody hears it. And as a good friend of mine who's a special forces officer, he says, we're all primates, so we learn by pain and repetition. So every time, people, and it's kind of like, when we design our curriculum in Ag Eco, I say, okay, here are the 10 things we want students to know when they graduate. Just 10, right?
Yeah.
And they need to see that at least 5 times over their college career. Because it won't sink in until they've seen it 5 times. Right. And from different contexts, different perspectives, but the same principle. You talk about trade-offs, opportunity costs, those sorts of. You've got to keep saying it because they won't internalize it until they've heard it enough times and seen it, right? Seen what the context of that problem is.
Right.
And it's kind of like if you don't talk about ply lakes, but you got to talk about them from multiple perspectives. I mean, sort of the environmental perspective, the wildlife perspective, Right. But even it's a filtration point, right? And, so it.
I have seen oil and gas waste in a playa.
Yeah. Yeah, you're like, oh my God. Yeah.
No.
But it was like a lot of times where if you went back to the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, right?
Well,
Farmers had buffer strips everywhere.
Yeah.
They didn't know why they had them. It was probably just a convenient place to walk,
Yeah.
But they had them there. And then we discovered those buffer strips are hugely important because it keeps the field runoff from then going into streams, lakes, and rivers. It captures it, it filters it. But it's also a great place for biodiversity, for winter overpopulation of bugs. All of these things. And so, now we sort of accept them, especially in the Midwest, that buffer strips are that's an expected part of your management system, right? So I think the same thing has to happen with water. It's the same reason why I keep anytime I report stuff at meetings, like, here was trial A, trial B, trial C, and here was the average yield, here was the whatever, and out there on the side I said, here was the revenue per acre inch of water.
Absolutely.
Because I want you as a producer to immediately go back to that point.
Yes. Well, and when we pulled up because there's apply estimator, so people can go and click on their apply and see how much of recharge would be estimated per year if it was working, functioning, and I had one friend of mine that's a farmer said, that sells.
Yes.
That sells.
Yeah.
But it's a matter of, making sure that people understand what the percentage, first of all, that they're our fastest form of recharge.
Right.
Okay. So we're not saying that next year it's going to be fixed.
Yeah.
But they're the fastest form and 80-something% of them don't work.
Right.
I mean, that's a low hanging fruit. You know what I mean?
And not only that, is that you're selling them, it's not just recharge the aquifer, it's recharge immediately underneath them.
Yes.
And so that's the fastest way to get water back into that water table to you.
Yes, yeah. No, and I think sometimes it depends on, how deep, it's everybody's different, right? All those are different. But I mean, I've seen a farm in Lamb County where the guy recharged his playa and his quarter, his well remained stable, and the 3 quarters around him all dropped.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that is telling. You know what I mean? Like, that's worth doing.
Yeah.
But I'd love to have you back because I think we've only just begun.
There's lots of you're scratching the surface. You can go for days.
We could go for days. But I think it's really interesting, and I'd love to talk about like solutions, and how can what are things that we can do, and farmers are very aware. Let's talk about things that consumers can be aware of too. People that live in Lubbock, and so I appreciate you being here. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you so
thanks for having me on.
much. It's been great.
Yeah.
It was a great episode. And friends, thank you again for joining us for another episode of Conservation Stories. We will see you again next time.